Hi, everyone. I'm Kevin Miller. I'm the Director of Research at Independent Sector. We're going to take a moment and see if we get our guests today coming in. I see that we have some folks filtering in now. Thank you so much all for making time to be here this afternoon or this morning, depending on where you are, maybe even this evening if you're in Europe. Yeah, this is Strong Economy, Growing Struggles, Understanding Alice and Racial Disparities. If you're familiar with our work, you probably know that we have been working with United for Alice some time, talking about financial struggles of nonprofit workers. But we want to expand that conversation a bit today. But first, if the webinar chat is open, we'd like you to tell us where you're calling in from, where you're joining us from, and how you heard about this webinar, just to get us going and hear a little bit about you all. That would be great. But if the chat, great. Welcome. Michigan getting in there first with the first response. Good job, Midwest. Good representation. Some Californians. Hi, Californians. Good morning. Oh, lots of West Coast folks. Hi, Nashville. Hi, Providence. Hi, Delaware. Great. Well, keep those coming in. We find it's helpful to know where people are calling from or joining from, just so we can get a sense of the representation. It seems like y'all are from all over, so that's great to see. As I said before, we're here to have a broader conversation than we've had before on this topic. Just some housekeeping before we get started. We are being recorded. The goal is to have this be a resource later. So if your people from your organization or your network want to see this and they missed it, we'll have a recording they'll be able to watch later. We also will share slides and resources later after the webinar. That way we won't be bombarding you all with resources and links too much during the webinar. We are going to have Q&A open the whole time. So if you have questions for speakers, clarification, you need a word defined, you don't know how we did something or what we mean by something, drop it in the Q&A. If you have big conceptual questions for us, drop it in the Q&A. If we can, we'll try to answer questions as we go a bit, but otherwise we're going to reserve the last 15 minutes of this webinar strictly for audience questions. So please ask questions. We'd love to have a bit more of a dialogue than we would normally have if you all aren't asking those questions. All right, so let me see what else I need to share before we get going. So again, one of the things we want to talk about today is asset building and wealth. We'll talk a little bit about the Alice framework as we get going, but the Alice framework is mostly focused on income versus expenses. And while income is obviously a big part of saving and of wealth building, it's not the whole story. And so we invited some folks today to talk to us about, again, that fuller story around wealth building and how that shapes our economy over time. I want to thank our co-hosts. So United for Alice is co-hosting this with us, and we're happy to have Stephanie Hoops, their national director, here. I also want to thank the Black Wealth Data Center, who were a part of initiating this project and this collaboration, and our other speakers today for giving us their time and attention on this, and we're delighted to have them. So I will go ahead and introduce our speakers now. So in alphabetical order by last name, we have Dr. Stephanie Hoops, the National Director of United for Alice. Welcome back, Stephanie. We have Dr. Andre Perry, the Senior Fellow and Director of the Center for Community Uplift at the Brookings Institution. And we have Jia Zhang, Senior Research Analyst at the UCLA Latino Policy and Politics Institute and Manager of the Latino Data Hub. So welcome all. Thanks for being here. We're very happy to have you. And so just to move us into the content, You've now heard me say Alice a few times. Depending on where you came from and how familiar you are with our work, you may or may not know what Alice is. So we'd like to ask you quick, um, how familiar are you with Alice? Since we're going to have a Zoom poll that should pop up, and, there it is. Oh, I can't vote, but I've used Alice data in my work. So give that a second for people to respond. Let's see what we got. All right. So, okay. So we've got a wide variety. About a fifth of us have used Alice data in our work before. A fair number are somewhat familiar, and it's a new framework entirely for a good number of you. So that's great context. Thank you for sharing. We are going to define Alice and talk about that framework. But before we do that, I want to just note that again, our goal today is to use that framework to understand more broadly how nonprofit workers in particular are doing, but how nonprofit workers are part of a larger story in the economy. We have a lot of economic data out there that suggests that things are going really well, often in the United States, and there are a lot of people in the US that are not sharing in that prosperity or that wealth. And there are a lot of historical and ongoing reasons why that is. And so, again, our goal today is to try and understand better, um, both how the Alice framework a lot helps us understand those issues around wealth and asset building, and how wealth and asset building as frameworks can help us understand financial security and as well. So I think the wealth and income I think are often sort of conflated in people's minds, but they're not exactly the same thing, and we want to talk about that today. So, without further ado, I want to hear a bit more from Stephanie, about how we define, um, Alice. What is Alice, and what makes this framework useful?
Well, thanks for having me, Kevin. And it's been great partnering with you over the last 2 years, bringing great Alice data into the nonprofit workforce and kind of giving some crisp numbers to something that we've all been seeing. But here we can see what's uh, actually behind the numbers. So I'm going to share my screen and go through a few slides that can help hopefully bring Alice to life for everybody. So let's see. So to flesh out Alice is an acronym, asset limited, income constrained, employed, but it's a lot more than that. So before we get to the technical definition, let's just think about the people that we know that are Alice. It's in general, we have workers across our economy who help keep things running smoothly for us. Think about on your way to work, you are dropping your child off at childcare. The childcare worker might be Alice. The barista, when you're getting your coffee, might be Alice. And as you go to the bank teller, the public transit driver. And then I think about Alice on my way home from work when I'm picking up prepared food and who cooked that, and the delivery driver who dropped off a package. So many folks who help keep our economy running smoothly, we rely on and yet struggle to support their own families. Technically, we have households in poverty, and then above that, another chunk of our population are Alice, so earning above the federal poverty level, but below just the bare basic household budget. In the nonprofit sector, that turns out to be 5% of workers are fitting in that federal poverty definition. And if that's our sense of financial hardship in this country, it seems like it's a really small group. But you layer in Alice, and in the nonprofit sector, that's another 22% of workers, or another 17% of workers. So the total magnitude is 22%. So a very different picture emerges when you look at what it actually costs to live and work in the modern economy. So I have a figure here that I think sums
Can
up our work. Yeah.
you switch your just presenter mode again, so we can get it's in presenter. We're seeing presenter mode.
Oh,
Um,
shoot.
that way we
Sorry.
that's okay. That way we can get the bigger, literally bigger picture as
Right.
well.
I know. So from current slide, it is funny when we did our tech prep, it worked, but I don't know why it reverted. So let's see if we can get that better. It just seems to be working a little slow today. So which view are you seeing now?
Either yet, it is being slow.
All right. Well,
Oh,
hopefully this will.
it is now bigger. Great.
Okay, perfect. So this figure sums up kind of the work that we do. On the blue column represents that household survival budget for a family of four in kind of a income county in the country, Duval County, Florida. And that adds up to almost $90,000 when you have two kids in childcare. Compared to that is the salary of two full-time workers. So you're assuming in that family, you've got two adults, two workers, and they're in jobs that are, among the most common in Florida and actually across the country, personal care aide and a stock worker. And you add up that full-time year-round salary, and it's $66,000. And it's that gap between what it actually costs and what jobs pay of why we have so many Alice households. And then the rest of the figure compares that to some of our other official measures of financial hardship, federal poverty level, supplemental poverty level, that's not that different, and area median income. So probably measures that you all use regularly in your work, and you already know that they fall short of really describing what's happening on the ground. One of the main problems with the federal poverty level is it's the exact same number anywhere in the country, whereas the household survival budget for Alice is built for each county. And so we take into account that huge difference in cost of living between, let's say Manhattan or Mississippi, but we also then recognize the difference in income as well as wages vary region to region also. So this gives you some insight of how we build this. And just want to show you a couple. Alice lives in every state across the country, but every community as well. Alice is, we do a lot of breakdown by demographics, and here I wanted to show you a breakdown among the nonprofit workforce by race and ethnicity. And we think it's really important to recognize those differences. Some of our largest race ethnic groups, Black and Hispanic, are much more likely to be below the Alice threshold than white workers. And this is what we're going to be digging into today. We know a lot of the reasons behind that, and it still is showing up in the numbers. And this is a graph that will, talk a little bit more about trends over time. This is for all households, not just workers in the nonprofit sector. And what we see over the last 15 years is that the number in poverty has stayed relatively flat. The number that are Alice has ticked up slowly throughout the period. And if you think about this period, we've had a lot going on. We've had, economic downturns and recoveries. We've had Republican and Democratic administrations. We've had the pandemic and recovery. And we've had all the great work that you all are doing. And yet we have not been able to shift that trend line for Alice households. We don't know where that tipping point is for an economy, but it does seem that 42% of all households is extremely high and concerning. So gives us more urgency for our conversation today.
Great. Thank you, Stephanie. I want to ask you to chime in. I know a lot of your work addresses, again, these racial and ethnic gaps that we see in financial security and asset building and wealth building. Could you talk to us a little bit about what the dynamics are there, if they've changed over time, what you think the right background is for our audience to understand these things?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me, Kevin, and the independent sector for hosting this. But to really understand why Black and Brown households are disproportionately, Allison, they are, you have to go way back, not to just the Great Recession, not just the 80s, but way, way back. Just remember, just think about how the middle class was built. It was built through the GI Bill, the FHA mortgage program, union job manufacturing. Social Security at its founding was disproportionately favoring white families over Black and Latino families. Remember, at the time, Social Security excluded domestic workers and farm workers. Those are jobs that Black and Latinos held in disproportionate numbers. And what it means is that exclusion from those programs certainly impacted the wealth profiles of Black and Brown people, which are significantly lower. Those profiles are lower than their white and Asian counterparts. When we ask why Alice rates are higher in Black and Latino household today, the answer is because wealth is the buffer, and that buffer is lacking. We recently did a analysis of middle class households, and we used the EPI affordability calculator to get at how many middle class Americans can actually afford where they live. And the share of struggling middle class families vary by race. 27% of white families can afford or cannot afford to live where they are. 39% of Black families, 41% of Asian American families, 46% of Native American families, and 50% of Latino families cannot afford basic necessities. And that really shows that this affordability crisis is not just about current incomes and current rates of inflation. It is also about the past policies that deliberately excluded Black and Brown people from those various programs. So to address Alice for everyone, you have to address the past discrimination that's impacted families over time.
Talk a little bit more about trends over time and how trends have affected different families and households differently. So, Gia, if I can ask you to talk a little bit about what we know about data on Latinos in the U.S. and their sort of economic fortunes. Anything you can share again to give us, the the better again the picture there over time and or right now, I think would be helpful.
Yeah, thank you very much. Good morning and good morning, everyone, if you're joining from the West Coast, and good afternoon. Thank you, Kevin and the team, for the invitation, and I'm honored to be joining this stellar panel to discuss this important issue. As a data person, how measurements are defined is power. We often rely on traditional economic metrics such as GDP and CPI to understand how the overall economy is doing. However, I think it's important to acknowledge that some metrics do not reflect the reality of the working class. So, for example, we saw the most recent consumer price index was at 3.3% last month. And much of that was due to higher gas prices. The rest of the consumer price index is fine. That's what the economists are telling us. However, if you are like me, families paying for childcare, you might find that situation feels significantly worse than what the economy data suggests. For example, childcare prices have been growing at 1.5 times as fast as the overall inflation. So, however, it is not considered a necessity, and it's treated as a minor factor when they're calculating the consumer price index. The stock market is growing really high. The potential productivity gains from AI are great, but however, Latino and Black workers won't be able to share the prosperity if they aren't at the table. That is why I think we're looking to alternative frameworks like Alice to paint a real picture of how workers are doing. We at the UCLA Latino Policy and Politics Institute are committed to provide accurate, disaggregated data on the well-being of Latinos, and we recently launched a long-term research portfolio on Latino wealth building, particularly in areas of housing and entrepreneurship. I invite you to check out our websites and review the data and insights our team has compiled. I prepared 3 very brief slides to talk about Latino and wealth building. And Taylor, if you can bring it up, please. So the first one to start off is that Latino workers play an enormous role in the U.S. economy. They make up nearly 1 in 5 workers and drive the workforce growth. They're essential to sectors like construction, agricultural, logistics, hospitality, and care work, and it contributes more than $4.1 trillion annually to the U.S. GDP. And yet, these contributions have not translated into financial security for Latino households. Latino workers still see lower wages, fewer workplace protections, and slower income growth than many other workers. And when that happens at this scale, it has huge implications, not just for Latino workers, but the wealth of their households and of the nation. So we find that despite moderate improvement in Latino wealth, today, Latino own only 22 cents of wealth for every dollar of white wealth, a gap that has persisted for as long as such data has been collected. Latino households are far less likely to own high-value appreciating assets such as homes, retirement accounts, business equity, and are more likely to rely on high-cost debt to meet basic needs. And they're also more likely to take on high-cost debt that drains resources rather than build wealth. The next slide, please. This will show the overall trend and how that gap is persisting for as long as data goes back to. And then can we exit the slides, please? However, when trying to unpack the causes of the wealth gap, just as Andre shared, we found that the status quo doesn't just reflect on demographics and human capital differences in the population. It reflects history and generations of policy decisions. There is a well-documented history of Latino property owners stripped of their land and homes, Latino workers being shut out from jobs that offered pensions and stable wages growth and labor protections, and being excluded from some of the major U.S. policies that built wealth. We're going to talk more about those structural barriers by Latino and Black workers today, but for now, I wanted to highlight one set of policies that uniquely adversely impacted Latino economic growth, which is the U.S. immigration policy. That we know that created unequal pathways to legal status, shaping who can access stable work, credit, and long-term economic opportunity. And those without legal status or even perceived to lack of it face wage penalties, limited access to benefits, and barriers to starting business and buying homes. In the current immigration enforcement climate, we're seeing even more challenges that are posed to wipe out the wealth accumulated by Latino families. For example, we know the shift to mass deportation leads to increasing level of working age Latino men being apprehended and deported despite having no criminal history, and families experiencing a sudden loss of income and have to sell assets quickly. Workplace raids and the cancellation of work permits like temporary protected status disrupted the career of thousands of Latino workers. Research also documented that Latino-owned businesses are bellwethers of economic stress due to immigration enforcement and other federal policy, including the uncertainty brought by tariff. So I want to say is under the backdrop of a strong performing economy on paper, one has to wonder what the implications are to the economy when workers are removed from the workforce and small businesses are forced to shutter, and how to shelter these workers from further financial hardship. Thank you.
Thanks, Jia. Andre, can you tell us a little bit about how the story is different for Black households and workers? It is very tempting, right, to just say Black and brown households are worse off, and they are, often in the U.S., but the exact reasons why are different, and the policies affecting families and workers are different. Can you tell us a bit more about, the trends and policies that have affected Black workers and families?
Yeah, and I'll just pick up where you left off, is that when we say the economy is strong, we're typically talking about indicators like GDP, unemployment rates, stock market performance. And those numbers by conventional measures are good right now, and they've been so for a while. You have the pandemic as an aberration, but unemployment has been relatively low without that shock, and productivity is up. But here's the problem: those measures are in the aggregate. They describe averages, and averages, particularly those at the national scale, really mask who's being left out, particularly racially and geographically. Let's take this the stock market, for instance. Black Americans hold roughly 3.5% of stock market wealth, despite being 13% of 14% of the population. So when Wall Street has a great quarter, that wealth surge lands differently across populations. GDP per capita rising doesn't mean Black per capita income is rising at the same rate. And going back to the stock market, let's understand why that is the case. For the descendants of families who were once sold, owned, traded on the stock market, um, we have less discretionary income to actually invest in the stock market. And so those things are not coincidental. Those were a result of deliberate policy choices. And then look at wages, real wages, wages adjusted for inflation. They have barely moved for the bottom half of the income distribution. Black workers are overrepresented in those in that quintiles. Latino workers are overrepresented in those quintiles. So when real wages aren't growing, guess what? Nothing is ever affordable. And inflation just made the situation worse. So inflation on rents, food, energy, budgets. If you don't have a corresponding rise in income, you're just going to feel it more. And then, what's near and dear to my heart, a lot of people know me from my work on home ownership. Um, if you have lower home ownership rates, you're just going to have less of resource to draw upon when things get tough, when there's an economic shock. People who own homes will use the equity that's been built up over time and to deal with the shocks. But as we know, history, one, for most of American history, Black people were not allowed to own homes, not allowed to own property, and it was legal to discriminate Black people. So we haven't seen the kind of ownership among Black Americans than with other groups. And so there's less discretionary income to invest in businesses. Most people start their businesses using their personal wealth, the equity in their home. So, and when we're looking at trends, um, so when the stock market is up, you got to think about who's in the stock market, who has equity in resulting in securities. When you're looking at home prices, even now, that's you see the rise and fall of black wealth strongly associated with the rise and fall of home prices. When home ownership is up, or when home prices are up, black wealth is up. But when it's down, black wealth is down. This is because black wealth is, and I'll put this in air quotes, sort of over indexed in housing. But it's still much lower, 30 points lower in terms of ownership than our white counterparts. So you can't look at trends because trends are just measures of the aggregate that really mask what's happening at the racial and geographic scale. And so we always but this is the unfortunate part when we're talking about full employment and we're changing interest rates. That may have nothing. That's not even looking at black unemployment, which may still be in a recession, so to speak. So these aggregates, these trends, really don't reflect the day-to-day realities of black and brown people, and we need new measures. And this is what Alice is doing, new measures that allow us to see disadvantage, allow us to see who's struggling, allows us to see what kind of levers we need to pull in order to help a growing number of families in the United States.
As a researcher, I would love to talk about numbers for the rest of time, but let's talk a little bit about specific stories or examples of Alice families who are struggling. So I can ask Stephanie and Gia to talk a little bit about this. So Stephanie, we'll start with you. What are what kinds of stories to you make make people understand what it is to be living under that threshold?
Well, we actually have a great clip of Alice speaking for themselves, and so I'm hoping that you can play that for us.
Let's find out together. Let's see. All right. I will hit play, and if you all can't hear, let me know. It-
Not hearing it, Kevin. Oh,
ah,
shoot.
all right. Let me see if I can change my share settings. There it is. Share sound. See, I'm novice at sharing sound. Let's see. Although now it's not. Let's see. I cannot share sound apparently, so it is grayed out. So
Even the Alice PowerPoint is deprived of resources.
I will try one more time. Wait, hold on. Let me try this one more time, and if I can't do it, we'll just have to do without audio. Sorry, all. Yeah, I'm not sure why share sound is grayed out, but yes, but there are Alice stories online. But sorry, so I guess I will just ask you to say a bit more about this, Stephanie. Sorry for that.
No problem. Our technology is still figuring it out. And but it was a powerful clip in that Angela is a nonprofit executive director who works at a food bank and talks about the clients and that she also qualifies for the assistance that they're offering. And so I think that that's something very powerful that we're seeing, especially in the nonprofit sector. Alice is helping Alice, that we have Alice workers who are helping folks in their community who are also Alice. So I'm sure this is hitting home for many of you. You see that firsthand. You may have experienced it yourselves. Um, we do have a place on our website called Alice Voices, and I think it's really important to have Alice at the table, that we can bring our data and lots of important information, but it's to hear those individuals that struggle in your voice, those impossible choices that you have to make on a daily basis, that brings it home of why we're all doing this work.
Yeah. Gia, did you have anything to add about the types of stories you hear about?
Yeah, so we provide technical assistance to a lot of Latino serving nonprofits, especially when it relates to the availability of data for them to provide needs assessment, right? Fund grant like fundraising grant reports. We also run kind of a more in-depth engagement through our action lab that we co-design with the nonprofits to build their organizational capacity. So we have a front row seat to kind of nonprofit strengths and challenges. So we know that many Latino serving nonprofit workers are uniquely positioned to identify and solve problems within their communities. However, the primary concern when talking to them is not a lack of innovative solutions or big ideas, it's financial resources. That grants funded nonprofits struggle to fundraise and to provide competitive pay and benefits to employees. Many staff members have to wear multiple hats, and burnout and turnovers are extremely high. As a result, the very people that serving the community are also struggling financially. And it's a constant struggle regardless of their education level. I remember years ago, I was talking to a Head Start childcare center in upstate New York. The center director shared that over half of her staff were on food stamps. And the wage premium of having a bachelor's degree is extremely limited. Even college-educated full-time year-round childcare workers are only making about $36,000 annually, compared to $25,000 of those who have just graduated from high school. And I would say since last year, philanthropic organizations' overall reluctance to fund racial equity efforts, combined with across-the-board budget cuts at the governmental level, further contributes to the financial difficulties of Latino nonprofit workers. We have one partner organization in Central Valley. They provide services to immigrants in general. They had to close down and let go all of their employees due to sudden budget cuts, and then they were not able to get reimbursed for service that provided. So I think that the conversation about better pay and benefits for Alice workers should also involve the chronic underfunding of the nonprofit sector and the philanthropy's grant-making practices.
Thank you for that. And actually, let's roll right through on that on root causes, right? Because you just identified, I think, two of them for instability among nonprofit workers, right? Which are the funding sources are often unstable. But regarding racial disparities, what else would you identify as systemic and root cause, contributions to these disparities?
One slavery, full stop. The historic theft of dignity, wages, land, life itself has, incalculable impacts on society. Even how we view people as worthy of investment or not has its roots in slavery, and related to that is housing, as I mentioned before. Um, um, the descendants of people who were once considered property now having an opportunity to own a home, to start a business. Um, all that opportunity was throttled by historic discrimination. We know, most of us know the story of redlining, where the Homeowners Loan Corporation drew red lines around predominantly black neighborhoods, deeming them unworthy of various financial services after the Depression all the way up through the 70s. But while we think of redlining as been done away with, we know through my research on housing devaluation, we know that homes in black neighborhoods are still underpriced um, at a sum, or we found it by 23%, about 48,000 per home. Cumulatively, we found 156 billion in lost equity in those neighborhoods, and those are the funds that people use to send their kids to college. In fact, it would have paid for more than 8 million four-year degrees. It's the money people use to start businesses, would have paid for more than 4 million black-owned businesses based upon the average amount of black people use to start their firms. It's used for infrastructure, to move to a better neighborhood. Um, but I just want to be very clear that rem, rem, were policies that denied and throttled wealth creation in the housing sectors, and there are policies and practices we've grown to live with that result in this devaluation of property. We forget that single family zoning ordinances and many zoning ordinances have its root in in segregation. We forget that um, school zoning and the way we finance schools has its root in denying black and brown people the right to a well-resourced schools. Um, Care work is, I mean, we forget about care work. I was thinking about teachers, but care work in general, that is a dimension that doesn't get enough attention. Black and Latina women disproportionately carry both formal care work and informal care work. And the cost of that care eats an enormous share of Alice household budgets. And so when we devalue care work, pink collar jobs, in general, we also are burdening or creating an environment for Alice to exist. And then there's, again, the wealth building tools we can go on, retirement accounts, emergency saving, credit at fair rates. All these things are not equally accessible. And so it goes, the root certainly can go to the past, but we have uh, certain causes right now that are impacting families. We can go on for days how employer sponsored healthcare, for instance, um, privileges those who have it and who will work. I work at the Brookings Institution. I have an elaborate Cadillac version of healthcare. Many other people don't have that luxury, and many of those people are disproportionately black and brown. And so there are root causes and there are causes. There are things that are happening right now that's extracting wealth and opportunity, that's denying people the wages they deserve, denying people the benefits that they deserve. and and what I hope this work and this research does is get people to organize and to mobilize to see that this is a problem not just with black households, brown households, although there's a higher percentage of Alice households who are black and brown. But this is connected to us all. When we don't provide the resources that enable people to thrive, we're putting more and more people in peril. Wealth begets wealth in this economy. And Alice reflects a systemic denial of wealth. So we have to figure out new systems. I mean, the conversation has to be around systems change so that we can get to these root causes, these causes that create Alice.
Care work and pay collar jobs, because I think that's a big part of the nonprofit sector story specifically. But Gia, I wanted to give you a chance. Anything to add on systemic and root causes before we move on to nonprofit specific questions?
Many things that Andre mentioned, and I think if we want to understand why Latino workers are more likely to be allies today, the key point is this: that they were never excluded from work, but they were consistently excluded from the kind of jobs and protections that turn work into stability. So these arrangements didn't disappear, they evolved in today's market, that they are disproportionately in subcontracted, temp, gig workers, misclassified work. They often work more than full time, but with very volatile schedules, lower wages, and minimal benefits. The housing piece, there's a lot of collective shared barriers and root causes over a long period of time in terms of access, valuation, and ongoing cost and risk that really hurts ownership for Latino and Black families. And then there's also these unequal access to public investments. The GI Bill, like Andre mentioned, that we know that Latino veterans frequently face the barriers from lenders, schools, and local admins that denied benefits, that even though we see that Latino veterans do better than Latino non-veterans, but they still earn significantly less than white veterans across most occupations. And then how do we prepare Latino workers for the next wave of technological advancement in terms of automation and AI? We know that they're heavily concentrated in occupations most exposed to automation, but yet the same type of government-funded trainings, career ladders, and job protections remain unevenly accessible to Latino and Black workers. Thank you.
Thanks, Gia. So now I want to switch gears a little bit and talk specifically about Alice workers in the nonprofit sector. So again, this is something that Independent Sector and United for Alice have been working on together. So I'd love for Stephanie to take us through a little bit of what we know about Alice in the nonprofit sector, as well as some of the new findings we've had more recently about race and asset building in the sector.
Awesome. Yeah, it's been a great discovery path together, Kevin, with you and your colleagues at Independent Sector. And we've pulled in research advisory committee members, experts from across different industry sectors and size organizations and locations across the country to get a better understanding of Alice in the nonprofit workforce. Before I jump in, I'm going to take my slide sharing prerogative and circle back to one thing that both Andre and Z brought up a couple times is inflation. And I think it's just a great example of our current systems are not designed to help Alice. And so our current measure of inflation, the consumer price index, shows us the change in the cost of all goods and services that people of all incomes purchase in 75 urban locations. But when you look at just the things that Alice needs to buy, just those things in that household survival budget, housing, childcare, food, transportation, healthcare, smartphone, we see those goods increasing at a faster rate than CPI. So in this graph, you can see the yellow line is the Alice Essentials Index, and the blue is the CPI. And so we indexed it, so they both started at the same place in 2007, and you can see that the cost in that basket of just household basics has increased faster over the last decade and a half than that overall basket. And so that's exactly what you all were saying about, we see wages increasing at different junctures, but not fast enough to keep up with the change in the things that Alice needs to buy. And so just another tool in the toolbox to help pull back the layers and get behind some of those national averages that are concealing what's really happening for a large portion of the population. All right, so now I'm going to switch gears to dig in exactly to the nonprofit sector. And just a reminder, instead of 5% of workers struggling, it's another 17%, for a total of 22% of workers in the nonprofit sector living in households below the ALICE threshold. So it is a significant portion. And one of the interesting findings was that while ALICE is in every subsector within the nonprofit workforce, that there are higher rates in some uh, industry sectors than others, which isn't going to be surprising to this group. This is a kind of overview of the different industries, with healthcare being the largest, represented by the largest circle, and then uh, followed by education, social services, religious organizations, and then the many other industries that kind of help round out the this nonprofit workforce. So the dark blue slice of the pie is the percent that's below the ALICE threshold. So I thought we could dig into a couple. And here's education services, with the two largest being schools, followed by colleges. And we see 20% below the ALICE threshold in elementary and secondary schools, and 16% in colleges and universities. But when you dig down into some of those training and support services industries, we see almost a quarter of workers there. So literally, Alice is trying to help Alice get a better job. Um, Another place where we see a high percentage of Alice is in social assistance. So probably not surprising to folks on the call, but again, um, almost a third in individual and family services, over a third in child daycare. That's a sector that we really see this very strongly, and it is kind of the conundrum of our economy. So Alice needs childcare, so Alice can go to work, and yet many childcare workers are Alice. So if we can pay those workers more, the cost of childcare goes up, and the Alice workers who rely on the childcare struggle to be able to afford it. So there are some sectors where outside dollars are needed to should kind of round the square, that it on its own is not economically viable. So things that we need to dig into, that these numbers help explain. And for example, childcare is the workforce behind the workforce. We all depend on those Alice workers. If those Alice workers can't get to work because they don't have childcare, our whole economy has an impact. So there are, numerous reasons why the childcare challenge deserves a better solution, and those are the kinds of things that we're able to start putting a spotlight on. Just to highlight some of the specific occupations, some of them are very common across all of the nonprofit and for-profit sector, but obviously some are cleaners and nursing assistants are found in both the for-profit and nonprofit. Teachers are obviously more likely to be in the nonprofit, and so one of the things that you can dig into, and I hope Kevin will be able to share out more about the interactive website where we have this data and at the national level, but a lot more. It's also available at the state level. And this is what I'm really excited to share. We have a new fact sheet that we worked on over the last several months. And this is really getting to something that Andre was referencing very articulately. And I hope these are some figures that kind of help back that up. So so this is digging into a few questions on wealth and race in the nonprofit sector. So starting with looking at emergency savings for nonprofits. So the very basic first step in wealth building is just having those emergency savings. And there's the common question, do you have 3 months savings to cover expenses for 3 months. And overall, across nonprofit workers, 61% say yes. But when you divide that above and below the Alice threshold, you see a big difference. And when you break that down further by race and ethnicity, you see another layer of difference. So the gray bar in the middle is the average. The bars on the left are below the Alice threshold. So Black workers have the lowest percent of having savings for 3 months at 38% compared to 40 for Hispanic workers and 43 for white workers. So you can see that difference even within workers below the Alice threshold. I think what also stands out is that you see differences between Black and Hispanic workers and white workers above the Alice threshold. So even when you're slightly better off in terms of income, white workers are still slightly more likely to have at least the 3 month savings. And we see this play out in some of the other indicators as well. But again, we're just trying to peel back the layers of the onion and see what's behind that average. So another question is about so this is actually I think there's a typo in the cover letter here about the percentage of respondents with savings to cover 3 months expenses. I think this is actually the question about is your retirement on track? So 32% of households below the Alice threshold think their retirement is on track compared to 62% above. So again, a big difference that average of 53% conceals. So yeah, those are some of the highlights from our recent fact sheet, and um, happy to dig in more if we have time as we go on.
Thanks, Stephanie. Let's move on to sort of the implications of everything we've been talking about, where we go from here, and then on to audience Q&A. Andre, I know you're a man in demand who has to leave us in a few minutes. Is there anything you want to wrap up with in terms of what, policy implications, policy standards, best practices? What do you think people should be thinking about in terms of where we go from here?
Yeah, I'll pick up where Stephanie left off. When I look at the nonprofit sector, what I see is structural failure. You have people who are working in a nonprofit sector who are now seeking services. This is a problem. And so in some cases, there's no way around this. We need a fix for healthcare. We need a fix for higher education. We need a fix for childcare. Meaning, when it comes to higher education and healthcare, we need a single payer system. We need not to have to worry if you are employed by a nonprofit sector that you get less a care. If you are going to college and you can't afford a college, I mean, just like we have an option for public K through 12, we need one for higher education. And then those workers in those sectors need to be paid well. Like what we keep doing is having these band-aids along the way and not dealing with the structures of inequality. And then one final thing that the tension is around, hey, we know we have to have some intentionality to address these racial gaps, but we also need to be inclusive at the same time because we know that many groups, white, Asian, whatever, are struggling. And so we also need that evidence to show that helping one group does not necessarily mean you hurt another. And we also need to reckon with, we need to help multiple groups at the same time. Many people become Alice in many different ways. Some of it might be discrimination, some of it might be a lack of investment in rural communities, but they're there. So for me, we need to figure out ways to acknowledge how each group got there, but also have a solution that will address the asset need that was created through policy and is um, 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 managed by policy. So unfortunately, I do have to go, but it's been my pleasure. But my colleagues will pick it up, and I actually have a colleague on the call as well who can pick up the slack where I left off.
Thanks very much for joining us.
All right, thank you.
Yeah. Stephanie, would you like to chime in next on sort of where, United for Alice and the United Ways are thinking about how to intervene in this space?
So while we raise up these issues, United for Alice does not do specific advocacy, but that doesn't mean we don't have a huge set of examples of our partners doing great work in this field, and that is our goal, is to get this data into hands of folks who are doing important work and can drive better either policy or program outcomes. And so some of the things that I love highlighting are picking up on Andre talking about home ownership. One of our data points highlights how many households below the Alice threshold are paying more for rent than the median owner costs. And for that same geography, we can look at home ownership rates broken down by race and ethnicity. And so programs that are starting to help renters become homeowners, overcoming some of those obstacles, such as accumulating enough for a down payment, having a credit score that qualifies you for a lower interest rate, and targeting that for Hispanic families, Black families, can help to shrink the wealth gap, the home ownership gap. And unfortunately, it's going to take more than just a couple programs to make that difference. That we see our Alice data aligning so closely to those long, we thought the redlining was done and over, and still to today, where Alice lives matches very closely to where those red lines were drawn. And so you can see the decades of impact of some of these policies.
Yeah, anything to add about your work in terms of again, the Latino Data Hub and how your data is used, or, what, if you see opportunities for changing some of these obstacles and challenges?
Yeah, I think we would have to go back to the point about better data disaggregation, that it forces us to move away from like one size fit all solutions. And we know that Latinos, for example, are not a monolith. Wealth, income, and stability vary widely by race, gender, immigration status, occupation, and geography. So if we don't design policies with those differences in mind, we risk reinforcing inequities even when our intentions are good. So take gender, for example. Women make up a significant share of the nonprofit and care economy workforce. Yet we know Latinas own a fraction of the wealth of Latino men, driven by lower wages, caregiving needs, and limited access to benefits. So if organizations don't disaggregate compensation benefits and advancement data by race and gender, those gaps remain invisible and therefore unaddressed. But I do think we do face sometimes tension between better disaggregation data versus a multiracial solidarity in terms of challenges that faced commonly across racial and ethnic groups. How do we get multiracial buy-ins into some of those policies and proposals is something that I'm glad I'm a part of this conversation, because a lot of Andrew's point and my points are very closely aligned with each other. So there's a lot of common ground that we can work on.
Yeah. Transitioning to some audience questions. So, and this connects back to a point that you made, Gia, about funding instability and for nonprofits and their workers and how that affects them. But so I guess I'll pitch it to both of you. Inri, like, where do we think there are opportunities to fund nonprofits differently or to fund low wage occupations and differently? How can our society, direct more value, both sort of, figuratively and literally in terms of money, towards some of these really critical professions, occupations, and roles that people in nonprofits that are underpaid currently do?
I would love to answer that question, but I don't want to jump in if it's not my turn.
Go
Go
for
ahead.
it.
Great. So especially in terms of nonprofits, I think this is a message that the board members of nonprofits and funders of nonprofits need to hear. That oftentimes, and we're hearing a really positive response from funders that they are understanding that nonprofit workers are part of the program. They are the service that if you want high quality outcomes, you need high quality folks delivering. And so we're hearing that message resonating. It's funny sometimes that more reluctance is on the board members of those nonprofits who are so anxious to keep, quote, overhead low, and get every dollar into the community that they can. And so I think it's really important for them to think about their staff and what their role is, that they are part of that community. And so to treat them well and to assure that they are at least earning above that that Alice threshold, that federal poverty level is not enough. And this is exactly the example and the investment that's needed. And start right at home. Start with your own workforce and build out from there.
Yeah. Did you?
Um, we're seeing some funders, some foundations are becoming more like invested in their grantees. And we're seeing a lot of foundations have decided they're going to do more like nonprofit accelerators, which is that they're going to provide like capacity building on all fronts to diversify the funding streams and making sure that organizations that they fund are doing great work, but also doing it in a sustainable way. And we are fortunate to be partners for some of these efforts. I find that just very extremely exciting to be work on initiatives like that. But I also feel like similar to what Stephanie mentioned, that within the nonprofit sector itself, that people needs to, I feel like there needs to be more honest conversation about they need more flexibility in how they spend their fund. And then they need better compensations, that people shouldn't price things too cheaply. And then but really think about what is a living wage, what is a livable wage, and then how do they maintain the organization. So I feel like there needs to be some mind shift going on as well.
So, coming back to one of the central questions for this webinar around the fact that wealth and income aren't the same, and the the insufficiency to get the complete picture with just income data or just talking about income. What do you all think, policymakers, nonprofit leaders, or researchers either how they need to shift their thinking, and what would help them do that? Like, obviously, again, we're all researchers, so like better data, yes, should help them think about this. But like specifically, are there studies? Are there frameworks? Are there, like examples? What do you all find effective for talking about these things?
Well, we definitely need better data. You know how hard it was to pull together, the few series of facts that we could present out. But I think that there's enough data to show very clearly that the income gap leads to a wealth gap, and the wealth gap is bigger than the income gap. So we can fine tune that, and we can dig into understand more in terms of housing and credit card debt and student loans and investment in the stock market and pull those apart, would provide additional insights. I think the amounts that are invested in the stock market, the value of homes is going to show even bigger differences as well. But I think the point is we know that there's that gap. How do we start to close it? There's a lot that's being done around home ownership. Fabulous start. But the other place I think that inroads are possible, and I wanted to mention a program that my colleagues at United for Alice are developing is called Alice at Work, and it's to help employers, business leaders understand about Alice in their workforce and to do better not only for those workers, but it actually has a positive effect for the whole company in terms of retention, productivity, turnover. And so understanding when your workers struggle, what's the impact on your business. And there's lots of ways to make a difference for those employees. Some are pretty straightforward related to money, increasing wages. Some things don't cost anything. Sometimes it's a scheduling adjustment that can make a huge difference for an Alice worker. If they can arrive 15 minutes later, they can drop their child off at childcare when it opens instead of having to pay extra for early care. Things like that might not make a difference at all to a company, but for a family, that could be a whole hour of childcare costs saved or additional transportation costs. So things like that can be win-win very quickly. But another area where, and specifically to the wealth gap issue, is on benefits. And so we do see Alice more likely to be working in part-time jobs and gig work and places where there aren't the same kind of benefits offered. So if there were nonprofits are talking about participating in pooled benefits programs that where each nonprofit on its own may be too small to offer these. If they're joined in a regional coalition or a subject area combination, that would be possible. That would be a huge difference. And then sometimes it's just not fully understanding where your workforce is in terms of being able to participate in things like a 401k. And one of my favorite, we've got a couple good examples, and the first one is from a nonprofit itself, is that the organization was offering a 401k program with a match. And so, gosh, here's the company's willing to put in some money, and the employees needed to provide their share for it to happen. And after going through Alice at Work, the nonprofit management said, why are we requiring the match? If we're willing to, put this in our workers' account, and some of them don't even have, the extra cash to provide the match, they're losing out in a double way. And so they went home and changed the policy. Like there was immediate improvement for a lot of Alice families in one policy change. So that one I love. And then another example is a company was again offering a 401k and seeing a very low take up, especially among their younger workers and their lower wage workers. And after bringing that up, the response was, well, have you talked to the workers? So that's always a good first step. And what they learned was that many of those workers had student loans. And so they couldn't participate in a 401k, that their extra cash was going to pay that off. And only once that was gone could they then start to look ahead and at retirement. And so the company was wanting to help their workers in this kind of way. And so they expanded their offerings. And so they would match a 401k contribution as well as a student loan contribution. And again, they had a lot of happy workers with that very fast policy change. So just to highlight that there are some positive examples out there and that we can do better.
Thanks so much, Stephanie. And thanks again, Gia, for joining us. I want to close out and just encourage all of you, if you found this interesting or useful, Both United for Alice and Independent Sector have more resources on our website in terms of data and dashboards. We would also encourage you, the link is in the chat and we'll send it via email as well, to tell us how we did today and what we can improve on. And certainly, again, like Stephanie said, United for Alice is a research only outfit, but Independent Sector isn't. And we do direct lobbying and advocacy, and we encourage everyone else to do the same. And so you can go to our website and find out how to get involved in policy change and systems change. And we encourage you to do that. And that's going to wrap us up for the day. Again, thank you all for your time, both our speakers and all of our visitors. And we hope to see you at future events. Thanks again.